You don't really have control over what's in your past. You can't dwell on things that have happened. You just have the ability to control how you react and how you move forward.
Welcome to Mindset Lessons from the Field. I'm Gina Kazazza, the author of the upcoming memoir, Training with the SEAL. Today's guest was a Special Operations Aviation Officer in the Elite 160th SOAR, the Night Stalkers. Leading missions in Iraq, Syria, and across Europe, he went on to earn his MBA from Vanderbilt and now drives strategic changes at a leading consulting company. He is a combat-proven pilot, West Point grad, and expert problem solver. Ladies and gentlemen, without further introduction, Josh Morton. Josh, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you so much for the invitation, and I'm excited to get into a good conversation here.
Definitely. I'm really excited. I'm really excited to talk about you and your particular story and what you can share for our listeners. But I wanted to get into, I find this so interesting with the Night Stalkers. We've had a couple of you guys on the show, and I am just so fascinated with your execution, in terms of the creed of plus or minus 30 seconds. I'm like, oh my God, that is immense pressure on plus or minus 30 seconds, especially since you guys are all about, the high stake missions. And, everything's about timing. And, I want to know, how do you stay calm under that type of pressure? And do you have any stories in regards to, running late or about to be running late or anything like that?
First off, the plus or minus 30 seconds, that's definitely the 160th trademark. That's our bond with our customers and basically what we agree to when we enter into a mission with them. And we're always focused on, the utmost professional support we can provide and enabling their mission on the ground first and foremost. But, there are definitely tons of stories I can think of. And yeah, plus or minus 30 seconds, like a minute window seems super small when it comes to, thinking of hundreds of miles of covering distances into, other countries or behind enemy lines, if you will. And there is a lot of pressure there. But I think, especially being raised the way that I was at the time that I went through Green Platoon in 2015, and then in the couple of years that I was actually flying before my accident, it definitely builds and you build that confidence and being able to hit the window and, making sure that you're doing it right all the times in customer support environments, whether you're training with the customer or, whether you're downrange doing an actual mission. Like I said, in Green Platoon, there are definitely plenty of instances as a student pilot where, you're kind of put in a pressure cooker in different phases, and the stresses are, partially, self-imposed with your pressure to perform in that instance, but also the way that the instructor pilots that, were the original members of the unit back to the early 80s and developed a lot of what the unit's known for. They're the instructors that are sitting next to you and saying things that might stress you out, or,
Yeah.
providing miscues or any number of other things that, as a student pilot, doing, hour and a half long flights, in the local area close to Fort Campbell, you definitely run late a little bit, or you might be ahead of time and you have to slow down and figure it out. Because, even if you arrive 35 seconds ahead of true TOT or time on target, you essentially failed the mission because you're early. Like, everything is coordinated based on that time on target, especially in a combat environment where, you have fires, you have sequencing of other players in the airspace, of everything else that's supposed to happen. The synchronization of assets is extremely important, and I think the 160 it definitely puts it the forefront of everything that they do.
How was it for you in terms of did you have a exercise or anything that you did in terms of I remember we had Michael on the show, he's now in Chick-fil-A. He was talking about how it's always white knuckle flying. He's like, you're stressed out all the time. He's like, you're always stressed out. How do you handle and manage stress, and how did you do it? Was there, maybe you came in differently? And then I know also you came from West Point, so I also feel like they breed different people. So it's just how did your stress management evolved over the years?
When it comes to stress management, I think for me, a lot of it was based on, a little bit of upbringing and sort of what I grew up with and having to have a resilient mindset from an early childhood. That was part of it, but also just, maturing through all of the different experiences that I had, setting goals here and there, whether it was going to a service academy. Okay. I had a service academy trying to excel and definitely wasn't an academic. So I didn't have any like grand ideas that I wanted to graduate, first or even in like the top 100, 200 people. Like all I wanted was to branch aviation because that was what I was focused on. And so setting those goals along the way, I think definitely helped me stay focused, and in a way of staying focused, able to modulate some of the different stressors and things that you deal with at each of those levels. And as you continue to test yourself and put yourself under new stressors, you're building that resilience that I think, in the end, like when you have to be put, or when you find yourself in those environments where you're doing those high stakes missions, or everything from the training or operational training environments to combat environments, whether it's A to the X or to the, an offset infill, or, just doing support routes or training downrange with your customers. I think, you kind of have that same mindset, and it just becomes okay, this is the given standard and you meet the standard in every way. And, it becomes, yeah, there might be more elements that you have to manage along the way, or like things that really become critical. But for me, it was more of, being ready to react, and knowing that I'll, just remaining calm under pressure in those situations, having tested myself, and, the resilience that I feel like I had from an early onset, even before my injury, I think was something that allowed me to manage those situations maybe, a little bit better than somebody that hadn't been tested in similar ways.
So let's now back up a little bit. Let's go into childhood in terms of what made you go. At what point did you know, like, I want to be in aviation, right? And what led you to the path of West Point?
So I was always one of those kids, like I hear an airliner overhead, and I would look up in the sky, or a helicopter, you name it. It was sort of always the thing that captured my attention, and was always interested in aviation. Neither of my parents, came from an aviation background or were pilots. I think the only person in my family who was a pilot was my uncle, and he gave me some introductory flight lessons like when I was, 14 or 15, but I definitely had the aviation bug way before that. I think, that
And by
interest
the
is
way, was anyone military before you decided to join military?
not in my family.
Okay.
I was really the first person in my family to go to West Point or a service academy and join the military. Essentially, setting that sight on being a pilot at some point, I looked at, okay, my primary career I want it to be as an airline pilot. How do I get there? Training is expensive, but I know there are a lot of guys that go fly, F-18s, or, Top Gun, was one of my favorite movies growing up. And so, being a naval aviator was actually like my number one focus all through high school. And that was really what I had set my sights on. I don't admit that to a lot of people, especially not my West Point alumni grads, but it's just one of those things that, I viewed it as the way to get to that final destination as an airline pilot. I landed at West Point just based on, actually, funny of all things, the Army was the only branch that was willing to give me a waiver for a peanut allergy, believe it or not. I had
No.
gotten letters of assurance, which is kind of like a precursor to a true acceptance letter from the Air Force Academy, Naval Academy, and West Point. But when it came to doing the actual final physicals, the peanut allergy was disqualifying for all the services. And Air Force and Navy were like, yeah, sorry, it's 2008. There's not a whole lot, and like it's competitive enough as it is. Like we can find enough qualified people that we don't need to sign up for that. And then, the Army was like, come on in. Like we can definitely use you there, about, surge going on and everything else going on at the time is like, yeah, we're probably going to need some people. So that's sort of how it worked out. I honestly probably like didn't want to apply to West Point. I didn't think, it was going to be a good fit for me to be in the Army thing. Like I was like, I don't know about flying helicopters, but I actually had a close family friend. I grew up, doing the same swimming with his daughters, and he turned me on to the idea of West Point. He was I think, class of 79 grad. And my high school guidance counselor at the time was in the first class of females at West Point. And so she definitely planted that seed as well, and encouraged me to still apply. And so I did. And, lo and behold, that's the one that kind of panned out, and I ended up there. And the first time that I saw the campus was when I showed up on our day. I think it was probably June 30th, 2008.
So was it like a big cultural shock for you? And was there any point where you were like, I don't know if this is for me?
I mean, it was definitely a culture shock, but like knowing that I wanted to go to a service academy, I tried to, prepare myself. Like I'd applied to some of the summer leadership seminars that they run for high schoolers and didn't end up getting into any of those. I was living in New Mexico at the time, so the East Coast. I was a little bit further away. I think
Mm-hmm.
the only academy that I really seen up close and personal was Air Force, because it was up in Colorado Springs, and easy road trip for family one summer, check out the mountains kind of thing. But other than that, it was definitely a culture shock. So I tried to de-risk it enough for me by doing a little bit of JRTC in high school, so I had an idea of like, okay, what is shining boots and uniform maintenance and making sure, like, understanding the lingo and all this other stuff that I, probably, would lessen the shock a little bit, showing up into that environment, already having, at least a base knowledge of a lot of it.
Did that help you?
I mean, I don't know that it would have changed anything had I not done it. It, might have made the first week or two a little bit more difficult, but,
Mm-hmm.
I knew what I was signing up for, and that, for me, especially, I was, I think, sixth grade when September 11th happened. And, at that point, it was still, pretty profound in my mind that I wanted to serve, and felt that calling to, have something or have a purpose higher than my own, and faced by that sort of motivator, in addition to wanting to be a pilot, and military aviation being kind of the area that I was most interested in. I wasn't going to say I quit, let me go home kind of thing.
You had your Army, West Point, you have aviation in your, your forefront. How walk us through the path in terms of getting there and being a Night Stalker? Was there ever any point that that goal that you had didn't look like it was, stay in the forefront, where you were like, it was a bit more challenging to get there and things like that? And then if so, how'd you get through that to hit that goal?
I don't think I'd set the goal to, make it to the 160th until probably the summer between my sophomore and junior year. That
Okay.
was the summer that I opted to do what we call a CTLT, which was essentially a month long, where we got to shadow either a lieutenant or a captain that was doing a platoon leader job at a unit in the Army, and kind of go check it out. And I was fortunate enough to be selected to go to 3rd Battalion, 160th down in Savannah for a month, and kind of, see what it was all about. At the time, I was loosely aware of the 160th, just based on Black Hawk Down and, a number of the other missions that they'd been involved in, and, early Afghanistan and Iraq stuff, through the early 2000s. But I didn't really, I mean, being a special ops unit, there's not a real good view behind that curtain until you're kind of there, and or at least in the Army, and a little bit more familiar with how things work. And so that was cool, a great experience for me to really see, okay, these are the things that this unit's doing, and they're really busy right now. And it definitely seemed like a good fit for me. I just about everything that I've done, I felt like, okay, I'm always trying to, you know, pursue whatever's going to be the more difficult or more selective route when it comes to differentiating myself. And just because I felt like I definitely was able to meet that bar, and knew that it was something that, like, the kind of culture just alone is one that you're surrounded by like-minded people. They're all driven to pursue excellence in every regard, and that was just motivating to me to want to be around that. And I tried to seek that out no matter where I was.
When did you how well, let's talk about how was the path to getting there? Like in terms of, okay, I decided this is the way I really want to go Night Stalker. How was the plan in order to get there? Was it smooth sailing, or did you have bumps along the way? If there were bumps, talk about how you got through that.
It's definitely not a path that, somebody fresh out of West Point can go straight to the 160. Like, it is not that environment at all. I mean, there are very few people that finish flight school and within a couple of years are, finding themselves at the 160th SOAR. I think my path was definitely non-traditional in a lot of regards, just because I made it over there probably 2, 3 year groups earlier than any of the peers or classmates of mine, that ended up coming to the unit finally got there. The path for me was definitely like, it's in my kind of future. I want to get there. I want to figure out how to do it. So I was trying to strategize, okay, when does it make sense to be able to drop these applications? Like, what do I need to do from a, flight status? Like, how many hours will I need? What other things are they looking for? What's going to give me the best chance of success? And assessing favorably, because it's not just like, oh, you want to get assigned there kind of thing, and pimp a branch manager to find how to, get over there and get that assignment. It's like you have to first, ask for an application. So you're talking to a recruiter, they're kind of screening you. If they think that, you might be able to, submit an application, they'll send you one. Then you have to submit the application with recommendations, and that requires, okay, your command has to be on board and they have to endorse you flying and leading at that level. And then the 160 has to say like, yeah, this person, we're willing to give them the opportunity to assess. And then you get pulled over there, week-long assessment, basically every other sort of assessment you can imagine for special operations. They find ways to stress you and to test you physically, test you mentally, test you as an aviator, make sure that you're up to stuff. And then you sit through a board, and the board was definitely something that I didn't expect, but very humbling in a lot of ways, but also kind of crazy highs at the end of it when they bring you back in and they tell you assessed favorably, and this is kind of the way forward, and give you some options in terms of the next steps are going to be. So it's definitely a well, I don't know, there are a lot of gates to process. For me to do it within 3 years of graduating from West Point, really within about 2 years of finishing flight school, that's definitely unheard of. And I, look at that as like, it's, I don't think that's just because, I am who I am. I think that, it's just the way that things sort of fell along the way. I had selected to fly the Kiowa or the OH-58 Delta coming straight out of flight school. And that was an aircraft that the Army was getting ready to get rid of. My unit was already at Fort Campbell. So we, essentially shared a same part of the airfield, just a little bit further on down the flight line. So there was, a number of, I don't know, synergies, if you want to call it that made sense for me, like to, okay, when my aircraft goes away and I don't have flying duties anymore, and instead of going and sitting on division staff at the 101st, maybe I can try and get pulled over for an assessment. And if they, assess me favorably because I'm already at Campbell and I have more than a year left on station before I would really be eligible to PCS again, they would be willing to pull me over and send me through and get a transition to, one of the aircraft that they flew. I knew that they were always relatively short on 47 pilots, and that was sort of, what I expected, would happen if I did assess favorably was, I'd end up flying 47s, which, for that mission and special operations, was something that I was, totally on board with. And the culture of that community at the regiment sort of mirrored a lot of where I came from the 58 community, being that, probably close to 50% of the Chinook guys in the regiment had flown the Kyle or that mission at some point before getting to the regiment. And so there were just a lot of things that definitely lined up. And the way that, or the timing in which that I submitted my application and, got pulled over for an assessment, and how I didn't really have any focus after we flew our aircraft to the boneyard. My Kiowa squadron was getting rid of our aircraft. Everything just sort of aligned and kind of came together for me.
So you said a lot of things that I found really interesting that I feel like equate to business. And as you are a consultant right now, you talked about like, okay, so you did have this aircraft. I didn't memorize everything you said, but there was the aircraft that you mentioned that you started, and you said that they were transitioning them out. So then you decided to pivot and do some other training, like on your own, like to decide, like you plan some stuff and pivoting, like, okay, well, if this doesn't work out, well, then this and that. It sounds like there's a lot of masterminding to, again, figure out how you can maximize your, I guess, strengths, and also keeping what you want in the forefront, right? And how can you be an asset all the time? So how do you then transition what you said to when you're consulting, like to businesses and things like that?
I think it's, less around being, a mastermind, or like really sort of laying stuff out and kind of like creating a whiteboard, if you will, of kind of like where you see things lining up with, the current, reality that you're experiencing. I think a lot of what it did was it taught me to be flexible and to be able to create sort of a loose roadmap or, whiteboard something and, you can always change or erase or be able to pivot on a dime if the initial hypothesis doesn't hold true or if
Mhm.
for whatever unforeseen circumstance you end up derailed or have to delay or go out somewhere else and do something. I think from my days in aviation and like the thoughts around how I managed my career, if you will. I think it was a lot around de-risking what I could and just kind of going with the flow and being able to react where it made the most sense, but being prepared to take anything. I think when it comes to applying those same principles to business and the way that I think about going into a new engagement or going into work with a new client, it's always about understanding the problem, confirming that you've scoped the problem effectively and you know what it's going to take or what areas you really need to dig into and become an expert on. And so it's a lot of that quick learning and being able to adjust and pivot. And you always have an initial hypothesis, but a lot of times the initial hypothesis isn't even remotely close to what the true cause or in a final solution in the end is really linked to. And so a lot of it's just being able to kind of adjust, adapt, move the pieces around. Like it's very strategic is one way to think of it, but like I view it as more like a issue tree and being able to adjust some of the placeholders along the way and going from there.
Want to pivot into your accident, and then I want to go back into comparing, not comparing, but like talking about business and, you know, coming from where you came from. But my question now for the accident is, I read a couple of your articles and, you talked about being an amputee by choice because you were battling the MRSA infection. I think there was an infection you were battling.
Hmm.
Now, what is going through your mind leading up to this decision, right? Of that's a obviously is life altering, right? I mean, either way, but then, and how do you mentally recover and rebuild from that? And talk about actually, you probably back up and just share with people the leading up to the accident that you had, and then that way they have
Mm.
some context clues.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sometimes I just jump right in.
In 2018, Friday, April 13th to be specific, I got T-boned on a motorcycle, and that's really the incident that completely changed my trajectory in life and in my career. I think, getting to the 160th when I did, doing what I did there, having deployed a handful of times and, gotten to work with really a great number of amazing customers and, felt like I was sort of at the pinnacle of whatever my career or time in the Army could have been. It just made fully mission qualified aviator, which as a commission guy on the 160th is kind of the mark that okay, I've proved my capability and my competency as an aviator, but also as a leader to be able to juggle all of those pilot responsibilities on top of what you're doing as a leader, as a platoon leader, OPSO or executive officer. And so I was like living life. I was in my late 20s, single. Yeah, that there was nothing I thought at the time that could really like strike me down and humble me. Obviously, things changed after the accident and being life flighted to Vanderbilt and spending the next 2 months in the hospital there, 10 plus surgeries, then being moved out to San Antonio where the Army has the Center for the Intrepid and, entering pretty intensive physical and mental rehabilitation for both my leg injuries and a traumatic brain injury and having probably another 5 or 6 procedures, leading into the amputation. And so there was a lot, that I dealt with in those really in 2018 as a whole. And, for me, I was, one of those hard charging guys. Like I hated being in a hospital and like confined, not able to walk, I don't even think I walked without crutches, certainly not without a cane since the accident when I really realized that my bone hadn't healed. And the reason it hadn't healed was because I had a lingering, and now it's a chronic MRSA infection of the bone. And so, those sorts of things and the quality of life I would have had, given everything that I'd seen. And granted, like, I'm at the Center for the Intrepid, one of the military's primary rehabilitative facilities, outside of Walter Reed, where, you see guys that have, had their legs blown off or have had similar accidents or, other line of duty incidents, whether it's, a crush injury or, explosion or any number of other things. Like, there are a lot of motorcycles, but it seemed like there were pretty diverse mechanisms of injury. And so seeing all those guys and coming in and, even as amputees, some of them had been salvaged before and, said 100% glad that they opted for or, had to have the amputation because that increased their quality of life significantly. Obviously, doing a lot of research and seeing those sort of patient testimonials, it gave me the confidence that, okay, that's probably what would be most advantageous to me in the situation, knowing that, I would never walk normally, would, probably need to, like, certainly never run or run at a really slow pace with an X-Fix sort of prosthetic device. And that wasn't me. I didn't want to feel like, something was holding me back. And, even though I'm a bloating amputee, like I definitely, see and acknowledge that there's a limitation there, but far less so. Like in that first year of being an amputee, I was back doing a lot of the things that I really wanted to do, on the hobby front and being active and hiking and, shooting competitively, and in my mind, kind of on a trajectory or a path that would put me back in the cockpit and potentially back at the unit that, I was, so honored to be a part of.
This podcast episode is brought to you by Thrivers Coffee. Podcast guest Nick McKinley's company, Deliver Fund, brings you guys Thrivers Coffee. It is ethically sourced, it's organic, and it supports traffic survivors. That is right. Thrivers Coffee is all about empowering us to making a difference in the fight to end human trafficking. That's why 100% of the proceeds go directly towards their goal of bringing freedom to victims of human trafficking. So if you guys love coffee that is organic, ethically sourced, and tastes absolutely delicious, and want to help to end the fight of human trafficking, check out Nick McKinley's company, Thrivers Coffee. Said so much there, and I was like really in it. Because that's like such a, like you said, you choose to be around hard chargers, right? You are a hard charger, right? And you're also surrounded by like the best, and and you're surrounded by people that demand the best for themselves and those around them. And then you end up having essentially a handicap compared to everybody around you. And were there how do you mentally, here's my question for you, and when I say how do you, I mean personally you, mentally rebuild and how do you mentally just accept where you are and then take the steps to move forward to get to where, did you set a goal for yourself in terms of, okay, I'm becoming an amputee by choice right now. This is what seems like it's going to be the best thing for me. And then have a goal for yourself and then plan and then work towards hitting that. And then how are your days? How is your mental health going through all this? Because of physical, it just takes a toll on you, the body, all that stuff.
For me, and the mental mindset that it took to get me through that and to make that decision and to progress with my rehab. And looking back, it's honestly difficult to say, what it was that it sort of got me through, each of those different gates. I think early on in my recovery, or, when I was initially hospitalized, there was another, former 160th pilot that was one of the first I think he was the first amputee to return to flight status after a, pretty similar motorcycle injury. And so he came, visited me in the hotel bed, and that was super inspirational to me. What he said, what he shared with me, seeing him in the flesh, after, my incident a couple of weeks before, was okay, there's definitely hope. This is where I need to go. And so that inspiration is something I held on to
What did
pretty
he
much throughout
say
my.
that really like that helped, like that you carried with you?
It's hard to remember exactly what he said just because I was so drugged up and
Yeah.
definitely still a little bit in and out of it. But um, I just remember, okay, and most of the guys, are who are at the 160 this specifically, in the community that he came from, they're kind of the people that deliver the reality. Like, they don't sugarcoat stuff. They're very direct. They say, shit's gonna be hard, but you just gotta suck it up and drive on, kind of thing. And that was sort of the approach that I had with a lot of things, and how I approached my recovery was like, okay, yeah, there will be hard days, but always think about what the future could hold. And that takes me back to like how I think I navigated some of the other stuff. Is like, you don't really have control over what's in your past. You can't dwell on things that have happened. You just have the ability to control how you react and how you move forward. I think with the rise of stoicism and a lot of those principles, those are things that probably helped me along the way in terms of what I was surrounding myself with. And that mentality of only being able to control my reaction to things, that was probably the foundation that I built that mindset or that mentality on, and in dealing with things as positively as I felt like I did. Don't get me wrong, like there were definitely some dark times and setbacks along the way, and I'm still dealing with those sorts of setbacks. And as I progressed that first year as an amputee, and kind of got back to a point where I was happy and able to do all the things that I wanted to do, I was humbled again pretty quickly when I started having pain and more swelling and other issues, that come to realize that that was really the first flare of a reinfection, or the same sort of continued infection in the bone that I had to deal with. And so now we're kind of getting to the end of 2019. My mindset is still largely like, okay, it's all right. Like, I've got some time. At the time, I was a captain, still had some, specific professional development requirements that I needed to, accomplish before I could be promoted or continue sort of my Army career. And all of that, was not exactly conducive to, still being in rehab at the time. But, I accepted the sort of delay, addressed what I could as quickly as I could, had a revision, so my second amputation, if you will, or them redoing stuff because of the bone infection and removing all the hardware and sort of resetting it to a baseline again about a year after my initial amputation. And so everything was going well. It was 2020, and we all know what happened in 2020. Health system shut down, things kind of drug on and got delayed. And after about 2 months of dealing with the military health system, after things shut down in March, April timeframe, I was kind of like, okay, this is not going to be a quick process. I don't know that I'm going to be able to hit that timeline. I'm probably going to get, passed over my initial look, which I didn't want to fall behind my peers. And that's when I, was kind of like, okay, let's just move forward. I can make a life for myself on the outside. And that was really the first time that I committed to the pivot, and, in a way gave up on, returning to duty and getting back to the 160th, and being able to fly again. And like, that was probably the darkest, I'd ever been mentally, because, me willing to accept that sort of defeat was not like, not like what I wanted to be, or what I wanted to embody. I viewed it, a little bit as a failure, and sort of giving up. I think I found ways, to justify that decision for me, whether it was, well, what happens if I get shot down? Am I going to become a limiting factor because, I'm not able to, run as far or as fast as everybody, or to navigate, crazy mountainous terrain with a prosthetic that I had to wear to fly with, or, what's it going to look like? I don't want to be that guy that becomes the limiting factor in anything that I'm doing, especially in a team environment, working, for really enabling the tier one sort of special operations unit. Though I knew that the likelihood of that, particular situation playing out was, very, very slim, didn't, you know, give me any real confidence that I could still be the same asset, and I could still be that same embodiment of a leader that I felt like I wanted to be, and wanted to continue developing into when I was in that community. And so, yeah, that's, ultimately how I justified that decision to myself. And and kind of set my sights on, what would be next, and making those new goals, or setting those new goals, and focusing, staying busy, and at the time having a lot of other new things in my life, kind of kept me busy and set, to the point where it's like I didn't let, more or worse, darker thoughts creep into my mind.
So is that what you would say helped you get through? Because I can understand in terms of that fear of that feeling of failure, where you decided, what, this just isn't. When I lost my hearing when I was 21, I went completely deaf in my left ear, and out of my control. Can't do anything about it, right? And you have these dark times where you're like, I had these dark times in work where I had to work twice as hard as everybody else because I had a handicap, right? That nobody knew about because I didn't talk about it, because I didn't want to be the handicapped, right? Didn't want to be the hinder.
Right.
But there was a point where I had to just accept that I'm deaf. And I had to just be like, you're deaf, like that's it. You just gotta accept it. And like it took me like 5 years to get there because I was fighting so hard to try and regain hearing. And I mean, there's no regaining hearing, so they say. And I was like, well, miracles happen every day. So I'd like fight and fight and fight and fight. And finally, at one point, I was just like, you have to lay it to rest. And I just felt like such a quitter. Like I just was like, and it just was, and I was in this dark, and also my life around me was pretty dark in terms of the job I was in and the person I was with and like all this stuff. So like that obviously didn't help the situation. But like I had to accept it, and then I had to pull myself out of that on my own and get to a place of acceptance, right? What did you do? Because I remember in one of your articles, you talked about like resilience, and we are a resilience podcast, so I really want to touch on this, is that it's not just toughness, but it's elasticity. It's all about bouncing back, right? Bouncing back and adapting. And this whole entire podcast theme has been with you adapting, right? So what are the daily thoughts and habits that have helped you build that kind of resilience?
The idea of resilience to me is one that I feel like I've lived my entire life, every bit that I can remember, having to overcome something, or, see displays of resilience in, any number of, other people outside of my environment, or even in my immediate family. I grew up with a father that was disabled when I was 4 years old. He had a heart attack and quadruple bypass surgery, and ultimately ended up with a brain injury as a result of that, because of not having enough oxygen during the surgery. And so, seeing what he struggled with, and how he had to navigate, through his, the rest of his life at that point. It wasn't able to work, could walk, but, had pretty limited balance, didn't speak with anything other than a computerized voice box that he had to type into. And so seeing that, and kind of being in that position from an early age where, I had to be a little bit more of a caretaker than, a son, and being able to learn and see my dad do, all of the normal, kind of father, man of the house stuff around home, like that. I think gave me a little bit of a different perspective. And going through the service academy experience, going through a flight school, and, performing all along the way, all the way through my time at the 160th, and getting into the special operations community, and being tested in, a variety of different ways, and that resilience. I think a lot of that goes back to it's showing up and making the most of everything that you can every single day. For me, in terms of resilience, and how I think, we can show up and be our most resilient selves, and in every aspect of life. It's all about showing up with that mindset, or that, open mind, and that curiosity to continue learning, continuing to develop, continuing to, accept the things that, are not in your control, but doing what you can to, temper your reaction to the things that are out of your control. To me, I think that's exactly what resilience is your ability to kind of bounce back when something pushes you down or pushes you back, and coming back even stronger, taking that forward with you as you, further try and de-risk your environment to, the whatever degree you determine is necessary in that situation. Everything is happens, in my opinion. Things happen for reasons. I just happen to sort of be in the wrong point in space, the wrong time. Kind of had to forgive and move forward and only focus on, okay, now, I'm on this little bit of a different course. How can I make the most of it? And how can I continue to lean forward and continue to pursue that, being surrounded by the best and being the best that I can every single day and, going from there.
It's interesting because you said, just wrong time and space, right? And then, I remember I was watching an interview on the girl that got her arm eaten by the surfer, that
Mhm.
got her arm by the shark. Alana, I think her name was something. She doing an interview and they asked her like, would if you knew that this was gonna be happening to you, would you have like would you go in the water? Like would you relive that and go through this path? She was like, yes, because and she like went through it. And I remember listening to it, and this was right around the time I lost my hearing, and I'm like, 100% no. I was like, what? And I was like, if you would have told me that at this point in time I was gonna lose my hearing because of this, and this, I'll let like speculation, this is what happened. 100% would never relive that. Like, no. And then it's funny though, because now it's a totally different story because of the path that I took, like on the lessons of resilience, all the stuff that brought me to Gina today versus Gina at 21. And it's just so funny because hearing what you're talking about and all this other stuff, I mean, it's all about your adaptability. It's all about your resilience. So it's all, I mean, that's what resilience is. It's like you bouncing back, also accepting it, accepting what's not in your control. And there is no going back. It's just this is what it is right now, and I have to
Exactly.
figure it out, right? And there's oh gosh, I know that we're low on time, but I just want to ask a couple of things because one thing I'm curious about for yourself now that you were consulting with corporations and stuff, like as someone who is around hard chargers, like who's been around hard chargers, are the best of the best, right? And I just remember this from being in Team Eagle One, the Navy SEAL Prep program. It's like I've never been around humans that just want to be better versions of themselves at all times. And like when I said to somebody the other day, I'm like, yeah, I want to do this 24-hour walk. I just want to walk for 24 hours, And they're like, why? And they're like, what? Like, who, meanwhile, if I said that to them, they'd be like, oh my God, that sounds amazing. Like, you're going to learn this lesson and this is going to, like, it's just a different mindset, right?
Mhm.
How do you adjust to the corporate mindset versus the Night Stalker mindsets? And do you find that it's a little different being around like how the people are over there? And then how do you adjust and navigate? And also, how do you meet people where they are versus if they're not as those hard charging driven individuals that you're normally around?
That's a difficult question. I think I'm going to try and peel it into a couple of different levels here. The environment at the 160th is totally different from anything in corporate America. I think the way that people are and the mindset and how they approach problems and how they approach a variety of situations is definitely different. I mean, nothing wrong with that. I think it's just everybody adapting to what's around them in their environment. And there's definitely a way of doing things, more directly or like having very, very fixed standards around the TOT window at the 160th, but being able to adjust and adapt to, literally everything else that you have to think of and deal with contingencies. And, there's always something that doesn't go according to plan, but you're going to plan, to be
By
able
the
to
way, I
execute.
don't mean to cut you off, but that line right there, I just feel like needs to be like stated in terms of like things aren't going to go according to plan, but you need to plan. And like my family does not understand that logic. And I am just like, you have to be planned. They're like, it never goes according to plan. I go, that's not the point. Can you just, sorry, can you continue with that? But also, can you touch base on why we need to do that?
I mean, failing to plan is basically planning for failure. That's kind of the tagline I think that gets used or used a lot and how it's interpreted. But, effectively, like we plan meticulously, but we also plan contingencies meticulously so that, when something happens, because it inevitably will, you know how to react. And a lot of times, may have to end up riffing off of that. Like, you're not going to have a bagged contingency plan for everything. It's a preparation to react to those things. It just makes you better when you're actually there in that situation, having to execute something that may or may not have been completely planned.
Now translate that though to you as a father. Do you plan in your family in terms of, you have two young kids? Do you like plan in terms of, you know, any, like for myself, I'm taking care of my nephew right now, 3 years old. Like yesterday, failed to plan. I mean, worst day in terms of like forgot about lunch, forgot about snacks. We're going out food shopping because I just got into town. We got a food shop, but I'm so focused on me, I forgot about the child I'm supposed to be taking care of. Right? Epic failure on the whole entire day in terms of that. Right? And now that'll never happen again. But I said to my family, I'm like, this is why we plan. Like, this is why, right? You as a father, especially running a household with two young kids, like, do you plan?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, kids are that part of the equation that make it so that you become a little bit more adaptable, and you have to be more flexible at times, but also, stay structured. If kids thrive on a specific routine, you kind of have to stick to that and do your best to enable those sorts of things. And so, yeah, every night my wife and I, we kind of review what the next, 12, 24 hours is going to look like, what she needs to, attend to, what I need to attend to, some of those things. And, we look, I mean, a lot of times it honestly feels like we're just trying to keep our head above water and survive. And that's kind of, how weekends go for us. But, if we have, deliberate plans or other stuff like that, we're definitely putting our heads together and making sure that we're all on the same page and doing what we can, or what we need to be able to enable each of our own individual priorities, as well as, what we need to, maintain as a family. Which, looking back 5 years ago, like before any of this came along, or was part of my environment, it was easy to just think about yourself, and it made dealing with a lot of those other aspects of life, even, I don't know, it was just easier to be more flexible. Now, competing priorities, it's just like layers on a cake where everything just continues to pile on. And how tall can you build it before it completely topples over?
It's just so funny because my parents are like, and my brothers, and they're like, you are just so regimented. And I'm just like, well, you guys question what you're going to eat. And I go, well, what if, or like what you're going to wear? And they're like, what if that changes, like in terms of what you're feeling? And I go, I didn't want to have sardine and eggs this morning, but that was on my schedule. And I go, I'm not deterring from my schedule just because my body's suddenly not in the mood. I was like, me rethinking is going to then hinder the 3 year old because I am on a schedule that then adjusts with him. And I'm just like, me then taking the moment to rethink and then having to plan and cook. What if I suddenly wanted something else? It's going to take a bit longer. That puts a kink into it. And I go, we don't adjust based off of my feelings. And that's your problem. And you guys are adjusting based off of your feelings because you're like, well, no, I'm going to feel like that day. And I go, well, when you have a plan, like that's it. Because also with him, plans don't go according to plan, but at least I like kind of have a schedule.
Yeah, you at least
So
have an idea, right?
I have an idea exactly. They don't understand that. I had to ask you because you said something in your article that I just thought was so good, especially for this show. I love this line where you asked, you are you the kind of leader that you would follow into chaos, right? And so what does leadership then look like to you, and how do you train people to become good leaders? Because that's a powerful, I feel like that line should be on every CEO and everybody like under you. Like, are you the type of leader that they would follow into chaos, that they could watch for themselves to like check themselves? I don't know, that was a really powerful line question actually.
To lead in that way, and be the leader that other people, really strive to follow. You first have to lead by example. I'm one of those people, like, a lot of times, especially, in the recent couple of years when I've been getting my start in consulting, and, in a new company, a new, totally foreign industry to me, was in receive mode, and thinking, okay, I'm trying to identify the picture of who I would want to follow. And what sort of, stuff are they doing, what example are they setting, how are they talking, all these things that, you can emulate. I think all throughout my entire life, whether it was attaching myself to mentors or, those people that had done the things that I wanted to do or was focused on doing and trying to follow them and picking their brains about, what makes a good leader to them, what did they think about when they're leading troops in battle, or how they navigated a shift away from the army, or what was their mentality going through flight school, all those things that I wanted to do, trying to be that person that was good at following, but also focused on that example that they were setting. And so all throughout my time, be it at West Point through different avenues as a leader, but also as a cadet, trying to set the example of, okay, what my idea of right looks like, or what everybody is telling one another what right needs to look like in that situation, and kind of evolving on that throughout my time in the military. And it's not all about like, I don't know, in my opinion, trying to like spout and be the voice that's driving order, barking orders, and driving something if you're trying to force it. I think a lot of it, true leadership, has to be inspirational, it has to be, organic and authentic in a lot of ways. And that's always what I've focused on. I'm sure I missed a mark time or two, or various places along the way. And that's probably not the best example of a leader that needs to be up in front of a super, super large organization. But I think leading and indexing on the setting an example first will allow all those other intrinsics as a leader to kind of fall into place.
I found a question for you. What do you feel like what advice do you have for us on that we should do on a daily basis to strengthen our mental fitness, build that resilience, build that grit, so that when life's challenges hit us, we are a bit more stronger to be able to bounce back?
Showing up as that person that's in that mindset to tackle a day and completely crush everything in your environment is how you need to show up to maximize resilience and to maximize learning and be ready to react. Like, you don't know what's going to happen, you don't know how one thing is going to throw your complete day's plans off kilter. And what are you going to do when that happens? Are you going to try and do a whole bunch to try and bring it back on track? Like, is that even possible? Or, are you able to quickly adapt and bounce back like a rubber band? Like that I think would be the simple thing. Like, it becomes more difficult to be resilient if you're totally there. You don't show up with that mindset to be the best, or to have that open mindset, if you will.
Thank you so much, and thank you for being on the show. You're really fantastic. I really enjoyed listening to you and getting all your advice, and I hope our listeners enjoyed it as well.
Oh, Gina, I really appreciate the opportunity to come and have these conversations and to talk about resilience, but to share part of my story. I really appreciate it, and I'm so honored that you asked me to be a guest on your show.
Of course, yeah. I mean, you have an incredible story, and I really like a lot of the stuff that you say, and like your articles on LinkedIn. I talk about it a lot because that's how I did my research in terms of from you and stuff. So you're in there in the show notes for everyone that's listening. We'll have all your contact information in there as well. If anyone wants to contact you, but or follow you on LinkedIn and stuff. You had some really great articles that I feel like everyone should listen, because we're touching some of the surface on a lot of stuff that you talked about, and diving really into leadership and, just like I said, leveling up your life. So you were really fantastic. And again, what an honor to have you on the show. And everyone that's listening, like, share, comment, become a Substack subscriber. It's completely free. You get podcast chapters, you get advice from our guests. I mean, there's so much great stuff on there. So come on over and join us. And I will see you guys all next Wednesday. Thank you so much.